In this video, I'm going to show you how I installed the Benchcrafted glide leg vise into my split top Rubo bench. So let's just get right at it. We're going to pick things up right after building the base. So if you haven't seen my video on building the base for the Rubo bench, I'll leave a link up top. The first step is to make a really long wide mortise in the front left leg. To do that, I'm using a Forstner bit in the drill press, and I'm just going to drill a series of overlapping holes until I've got most of the material removed along the entire length of where I want this mortise to be. When you use this method to make a mortise, it ends up creating a bunch of scallops or peaks in between all of those overlapping holes. So I just quickly use a chisel. I don't get too particular about this, and I just knock some of those peaks off so that it makes routing a little bit easier. When you do route the sides of the mortise straight, be sure to use a edge guide with your router. And if you run it down one side of the mortise and don't change the setting of where that fence is, you can then go and run it along the other side of the leg to center that mortise perfectly. Now, this method is going to leave rounded corners, so you can go back and clean those up with a chisel to square them off nicely once you're done. After completing the mortise, the next step is to drill a couple of holes in order to mount the main screw of the glide vise. So one of them is going to be a through hole, and one of them is just a large diameter flat bottom hole where the acetyl bushing is going to actually drop into. Now, I did a whole video on how to make a large flat bottom hole. I'll put a link up top so you can go and watch that video later. But basically, I'm just using a piece of plywood to act as a template guide for the pattern bit once I get to actually routing the hole out to the depth that I need it to be. Nice and flush. One of the challenges that I ran into when I was making the chop is it needs to be 9 inches wide. My jointer is only 6 inches wide, so I ended up having to make a jointer sled for my planer, and I kept it very simple. If you want to see how I did that, I'll leave a link up top to the video that I made on flattening wide boards. Once you've got one surface flat, you can then remove it from that jointer sled and run it back through the planer to get nice parallel surfaces. There are some nicks in my planer blades, so I just cleaned up the surface with my number 7 jointer plane. This allowed me to get two really flat surfaces in order to laminate the two pieces of walnut to make the chop. The final thickness of the chop needed to be 2.5 inches thick, and I didn't actually have a really thick piece of walnut stock in order to do that, so I just used a bunch of clamps and a bunch of glue and stuck them together, and we made a nice, real thick chunk of walnut. After the glue dried, I jointed one edge nice and straight so that I would be able to safely run it through the table saw to have two parallel edges. With the chop now at its final dimensions, I could go ahead and drill the through hole for the main screw of the vise, and I could also start to drill out the long wide mortise the same way we did on the front left leg in order to house the crisscross mechanism for the vise as well. I did it the same way, just using a Forstner bit along with the router and the edge guide. The crisscross mechanism utilizes what's called bearing plates, and there's one of them in the leg as well as the chop. Basically, they're just some metal plates that the crisscross mechanism rides up against as the vise opens and closes so that you don't wear away the wood on either the leg or the chop. For me, installing a vise like this is very exciting, and I really wanted to start seeing it work so that I knew I was on the right track. So I did a bit of a dry assembly or a trial fit, whatever you would like to call it, and I just wanted to make sure that all the holes lined up, everything ran nice and smoothly, because I didn't want any surprises once I started to actually assemble the remaining parts of the vise. Everything up to this point's been very straightforward, but when you mount the hand wheel into the chop, it needs to be centered in the hole that goes through the chop. And for that, I'm going to give a little more detail. I've got a horizontal line on here that indicates exactly where the center of the hole is for this main screw. What we'll do is we'll just line up the holes in the flange so that that pencil line that I made is exactly dead center on those holes. We're going to slide the hole screw to the right hand side, keeping those lines centered in the holes. And I'm just going to make a little mark on my tape over here on the edge of the flange. Then we're going to slide it all the other way And we'll do the same thing. We'll mark another pencil line over on this far side here of the flange. Now we're just going to center it between those two marks, and that'll get us centered horizontally. The green tape and the pencil lines get us centered vertically, but this will get us centered horizontally, and I think we've got it right there. So next thing we'll do is we'll just transfer where the center of these holes need to be, so I know where to drill these out to get the mounting screws drilled out and tapped. Okay, now we'll go drill this out on the drill press. Before going ahead and actually tapping these holes for the flange bolts, it's a good idea to use a countersink bit so that you'll be able to get the tap to start a little bit easier. Benchcrafted gives some really good tips on how to tap wood. So one of them is to make sure you keep that drill nice and perpendicular to the surface and just let the weight of the drill carry the tap into the wood, and you'll have very good results that way. Although I've actually tapped a lot of holes in metal over the years, this was the first time I've ever done it into wood. And to be quite honest, I was kind of concerned that I might make a mistake and maybe put too much torque on the drill and maybe strip out the holes, but following those guidelines in Benchcrafted's instructions worked great. The tap went in nice and smooth. I didn't have any issues at all, and they actually threaded right in with those machine bolts just like butter. You also need to center the main screw of the vise in the hole that goes through the leg. And you're basically going to use the same process you use to center it in the chop. And just mark off both the vertical and the horizontal extents of where that flange or the bolt on the back of the leg goes. And once you've done that, you can simply drill out your holes where they need to go and fasten it in place. Up here in Canada, we hate these flathead screws, so I'm probably going to use them because they're black on the acetal bushing, but I'm going to use these Red Robertson square drive ones for the back of the nut for the main screw on the vise. Now at this point you're ready to actually assemble the vise and test its operation. Although it's quite straightforward to assemble, it can be kind of awkward just because of the weight of the chop. What I chose to do was mount one crisscross arm in the chop and the other in the leg without the pivot pin installed between them. And I screwed the main screw into the nut on the back of the leg just a little bit so that the chop had somewhere to kind of be held stable. And once I got things lined up little by little, that's when I replaced the pivot pin into the center of those crisscross arms. All that's really left to complete the installation on the glide leg vise is cutting the chop off to the final length and shaping it, as well as cutting the pivot pins for the top of the crisscross arms to the correct length once the actual shape of the chop has been determined. So for now, I'll just leave you with the obligatory quick spin of the hand wheel that you have to do with the Benchcrafted glide leg vise. Until next time, go build something beautiful.